Welcome to the Tattooed Traveler. I'm Todd Newton, and welcome to an episode that you're going to find fascinating. Can you hear that flute? That's outstanding. Wasn't even planning on that. You're going to love this episode, whether you're a history buff, the owner of a curious mind, or just a traveling soul. This is really interesting stuff, taking you back in time. This is George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate. Let's go. You know, I have been to Washington, D.C. a dozen times over the years. I have family here, yet I have never had the opportunity to visit Mount Vernon, so I'm so excited to be doing it today. And I was really interested to learn that Mount Vernon receives no money from government grants. It is kept open and maintained solely by the proceeds from ticket sales. It costs about $28 for an adult to visit, discounts, of course, for children and veterans. And when you first enter, there is an orientation center. There's a lot to see in the orientation center, so don't be in a rush to blast through it and get out and see the mansion and the grounds. These statues are really well done, very intricate, of George Washington, Martha Washington, and their two grandchildren. Whenever I'm visiting someplace new, especially someplace with so much to see and so much to learn as Mount Vernon, what I like to do, and you can take this for what it's worth, but I like to get the lay of the land. I learned that from my dad. I like to have a little bit of a game plan to know where I'm going, know what I'm going to see, and make sure I can check everything off the list. This model of the Mount Vernon Mansion does an excellent job of helping you get an idea of exactly what you're going to see once you're inside. All of the bedrooms, George Washington's study where he penned so many great documents, and there's a short 3 or 4 minute introductory film as well, and then you are released out onto the grounds. It has been open to the public since 1860, and all of the credit goes to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. They are the ones responsible for the restoration and preservation of this almost 8,000 acres of land. Now, the admission to stroll the grounds and admission to go inside the mansion are separate, so my tour of the mansion isn't for a little bit. So we'll hit the grounds first and see all there is to see outside, then we'll go inside. And by visiting Mount Vernon, you're in pretty good company. 27 U.S. presidents have visited here. FDR, Jefferson, Lincoln, JFK, Ronald Reagan, many others. Thomas Edison himself installed electricity. That would have been in 1916. This is Washington's personal botanical garden. He was fascinated with gardening, and this was often where he would find solace, a little peace and quiet from the pressures of being a war general. Totally understandable. We all need a place where we can get away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. Plant life was abundant here at Mount Vernon. This is the 4-acre fruit garden. This is where you would find orchards of apples, cherries, and plums that would be used in the Washington's kitchen. Definitely getting my steps in today. Just up the path is the old coach house and the stables. Now, George Washington often wrote in detail about his horses. He kept 21 of them here at Mount Vernon, mainly for pulling his wagons, going fox hunting a couple of times a week. His two favorites were Blueskin and Nelson. Those are the two he rode during the war, and Nelson is the horse that is famously calm in the eye of battle. And there's one other horse to note, Prescott. That is the mighty white steed that Washington would often ride into different states in the nation when he was president. He certainly loved to make a grand entrance. And after the war, his favorite horses were put out to retirement here in the fields. An average of 1 million guests visit our first president's estate every single year. It's a lot to see with the gardens and the farm. Folks like the blacksmith here take you right back to the 18th century. It took a lot of people servants, skilled laborers to maintain Mount Vernon in its heyday. We mentioned the incredible landscaping before. This was the head landscaper's quarters. He was a 21-year-old bachelor that George Washington brought over from Scotland because he had heard he was the very best, and that's exactly what Washington demanded of his people. Pretty nice digs for a 21-year-old single guy working for the most famous man in the country, right? You'll be seeing a lot of the Potomac River in this video just because it is absolutely breathtaking. Even though I'm kind of partial to the Mississippi River because I was raised right on the banks of it, but the Potomac has a lot of historic significance. It's about 405 miles long, starts in West Virginia, rolls down through 4 U.S. states and the District of Columbia, and plays a big part in the development of our nation. George Washington saw the Potomac as sort of a highway between the east coast of the United States and the west coast of the country. And as part of the Compromise of 1790, he chose this land that is now Washington, D.C., to serve as the nation's new capital, which really made the Potomac the nation's river. During the Civil War, the Potomac River actually traced the border between the Union and the Confederacy and has always served as an avenue for transportation. Now, this is what is called the Old Tomb. This is where George Washington, Martha Washington, and 20 other family members were originally interred. That is, until they were moved in 1831 to the new tomb. Now, the new tomb was constructed based on George Washington's specifications. He left very clear details in his will of what he wanted this new tomb to be. It was to be larger, made of brick, better constructed, certainly more extravagant. And as we peek in here, that is George Washington's tomb on the right, Martha Washington's on the left, and through that black door, just over 20 other family members. There are a total of 30 Washington family members buried here on the grounds. And I would like to take a moment to say just how great the tour guides are here at Mount Vernon. I had a lot of questions, and they had all the answers. Really great. I appreciate it. We should point out, certainly reiterate, that Mount Vernon was a plantation, mainly a tobacco plantation, and there were slaves here, many of them. George Washington and Martha Washington either owned or rented over 300 slaves, and this memorial is in memory of those people who were forced to live and work here at Mount Vernon. This area was the slaves' graveyard, and it is full of unidentified graves. Yeah, farming made the Washington family very, very wealthy. Corn, hemp to a certain degree, and by the end of the 1700s, wheat had overtaken tobacco as Mount Vernon's cash crop. But make no mistake about it, George Washington was not out here himself. In fact, he inherited his first slave at the age of 11. And between him and Martha Washington, they had 318 slaves on the property, over half of them women, and they lived in shacks like this. Very few slaves lived alone. These shacks were quite often filled with families with many children who were expected to work 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, from sunup to sundown. He made them work hard, which is interesting because many people say that Washington struggled with the institution of slavery, and he made the decision to free all of the enslaved people he owned in his will. Nonetheless, it's important to remember that they were not here by choice, and they were not fairly compensated for the work they did. All right, heading back up the hill to the mansion now. The home was originally built by Washington's father in 1735, and at the time, it was just a 5-room, single-story house. It was George Washington who added a wing to each side and a second floor. As we go in, by the way, no video is allowed inside, but these are the photos from my visit. This is what's called the new room. This is where the Washingtons entertained their very special guests. It could be used as a dance hall, a banquet hall, a large dining room, sometimes even a concert hall. One of Washington's most prized possessions, and one he displayed prominently, was the Bastille key. the actual key that unlocked the notorious political prison in France, and it was presented to Washington as a symbol of independence in 1790. This is the breakfast nook where George and Martha would enjoy their stacks of hoe cakes slathered in butter and honey every morning. Kind of sounds good. All right, heading upstairs now. And again, George Washington built the second story onto the home to accommodate the many guests he welcomed. There are 5 bedrooms on the second story. And remember, he was a famous guy. During his 45 years of residence here, he welcomed almost 700 guests. But he and Martha liked their privacy. They had their own wing, and this was their private chambers. In fact, this bed is not only where George Washington and Martha Washington slept, but it is where he passed away. Interesting fact, this bed had to be custom made extra long because George Washington was an unusual 6 feet 3 inches tall. Now onto the study, which is a pretty fascinating place to be, considering we're talking about a man who had a hand in the United States Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the 27 Amendments, not to mention his farewell address. These were his actual glasses. I want to make sure I zoom in on those for you. And this trunk belonged to Washington. Got a lot of use out of that. But when it comes to his personal possessions, so many people wrote in saying, Todd, please show us the teeth, the famous George Washington teeth. By the time he became president at the age of 57, he needed a full set of dentures, which is odd because apparently he took pretty good care of his teeth, brushed regularly. But contrary to popular belief, Washington's dentures were not made of wood. They were made of human teeth and cow teeth. Look at those things. Can you imagine what those must have felt like in his mouth? No wonder he never smiled in photos. All right, last stop before we head out, the necessary. Good name. Technically, I suppose you could call it an outhouse, but this is just so much more ornate than an outhouse. The only problem I have with it, the only issue is, look at this. 0 privacy, 3 seats right next to each other. I love my family, but we don't need to be that close, right? Some pretty moving stuff. George Washington lived here at Mount Vernon until his death in December of 1799. And when we were in his study, you saw his wooden desk. That's the very desk at which he wrote his 23-page will. And when General Washington passed away, President Washington, take your pick, when he passed away, he had in his will that all of his enslaved people would be set free upon Martha's death. Martha actually had more slaves than George Washington did, which I thought was pretty interesting. But I spent a good 3.5 hours here. Could have spent 3.5 more. I hope you'll make it a point to swing by and learn even more about our country's history. There's a lot of it right here. Thank you so much for watching. Check us out online anytime at thetattootraveler.com. And until we meet again a little further down the road, travel safely.